Great. Well, thanks very much. I'd like to thank Sabrina and also the ShareWorld staff for the opportunity to speak today. We thought it'd be interesting to just talk about the topic about medical school, since it's still a very popular discipline for, especially with the students who are in high school here at ShareWorld or thinking about the future and such. It can be a very long and evolved process, but we thought just in the time that we have together that we could go through and at least hit some of the highlights and anticipating for some of the students who will be entering in college what they might want to consider. There's a lot of details that you'll learn along the way, but this may be some helpful initial stepping stones in getting to preparing for medical school application. So just a few words about me. I used to actually be a professor, assistant professor at Mayo Clinic, and I was staff physician there for 15 years. And about 10 years ago, I transitioned to the biotechnology field, so it allowed me to come back to Silicon Valley. The Mayo Clinic's in the Rochester, Minnesota area, which is one of the coldest parts of the country. Since I didn't grow up there, I'm used to the Silicon Valley, it was much more natural for me to come back, even though it's been nearly 20 years in the Midwest. So this is just a few descriptors of the Mayo Clinic. When I left about 10 years ago, we were seeing over 1 million patient visits per year. It's one of the largest healthcare institutions in the country, and it has its own medical school as well. It's a little bit smaller in size compared to some, but I was involved in the admissions process for medical students and also for residents in training as well. My department was in anesthesiology, but also I subspecialized in pain medicine. So I practiced those two disciplines as part of my clinical practice, but also I was spending about 2/3 of my time in the clinical research area, which is what eventually led me to moving into the biopharma space. I grew up here in Silicon Valley, as I mentioned, and I went to UC Davis for undergraduate. It was a very good experience there, and then subsequently I went to Loyola University in Chicago for my medical school training, and then went further into the Midwest. So since I've been back here in the local Bay Area, I've been with a number of companies, which is pretty standard for those of you that are in the industry area. My first company was at Johnson & Johnson. So I was involved in drug development with the clinical research aspects within that company. And then subsequently, I had experience with a couple of smaller companies, Anaceva and Impax. And then subsequently, now I'm with Pfizer at the Renault division, which is in South San Francisco. And I've been with them for about 4 years. So I oversee the clinical trials that we're developing for new biotechnology or biotherapeutic drugs in this area. So I kind of mentioned some of those details about myself because I kind of use myself as a case example of what you might consider for the course going through college and ultimately into medical school. And Sabrina thought it may be helpful to just mention some landscape about what's typical for medical training as well. And then we'll go into some of the different areas that we might consider as a student entering into college with a pre-medical focus and going into the field. So very common college is about 4 to 5 years. I think there's a little bit more flexibility now compared to years past. Before, many students tried to finish vigorously in 4 years' time, and now I recognize, especially some of the public universities, it's a little bit more difficult to get some of the core requirements done. So some students actually will take 5 years, and actually for a pre-med approach, it's not such a bad thing because it gives you more time to do other extracurricular activities as well. There's certainly some very unique students who are able to do everything, and I'm always impressed with them. I myself actually took 5 years, so I had 2 majors in biochemistry, and also I had a second major in psychology, so that I allowed to have a little bit extra time to focus on another discipline, but also I thought that knowing really hard science and then also some softer qualitative science like psychology could be useful in taking care of patients. And at the same time, it gave a little bit more time in preparing with the extracurricular activities as well. So one emphasis, I was speaking with my friend who's now the dean of the medical school in Georgia, and asking what's the perspective from a dean's perspective nowadays with regards to the majors. Even back 20 or so years ago when I was going through the process, that some people speculated, well gosh, I really like this other major, whether it's music or history, but it's not a traditional pre-med type of major. And I asked him, what's the perspective? And his advice was that you can actually pick the major that you're most interested in. He said that's okay, it's not uncommon these days. But at the same time, it's very important to have all the minimum requirements that are necessary to go into the application for medical school. So some of the ones, and it can vary from school to school, but it's at least 1 year of biology with lab. It's at least 1 year of physics with lab, 2 years of chemistry with lab, and that includes both the general inorganic chemistry and also organic chemistry as well. There's at least 1 year of English, so you need to know how to write and critically read very well. And then there can be other requirements also depending on the different schools. So there's different unique requirements school to school. And also even these base case types of requirements with biology and physics and such, there's some schools that require even longer than a minimum of 1 year. So you can couple a non-science major if that's your true interest, but you still have to complete these pre-medical requirements in order to submit an application that will be accepted by the medical school. Medical school is 4 years long. There are some uniqueness when I say the title Common Course of Medical Education Training, because they do have some schools coming right out of high school these days, say Northwestern University, some of the others, as well as a condensed bachelor's to medical school, so that once you're accepted, you can continue on and eventually you graduate with 2 degrees, both in the bachelor's area and also with an MD. But that's usually less common, and most commonly is usually this route where you complete your college, obtain your degree, and then go to college and then complete your medical degree. Internship and residency can range depending on what field or discipline, but it's usually about 3 to 6 years long. So the shorter ones, maybe like say family practice, is usually around 3 years time. Surgery can be 6 years or more, so depending on the individual schools and such. And sometimes even as you're going through the training, the schools may even change the requirement and make it a little bit longer as well. Because some fields, they require extra training in order for the individual to be proficient to be able to practice that discipline of medicine. Also, what's pretty common is fellowships these days, because it's an opportunity to subspecialize in a particular area. So as an example, someone may decide to go through a residency in surgery, and then they want to subspecialize in cardiac surgery. And that could depend on institution to institution, but it could range from 2 to 3 years of training. Some places may have clinical training along with some research component as well. I use that as more of an extreme example, excuse me, because that's usually a little bit longer in duration, and some fellowships can actually just be 1 year long. So for myself, anesthesiology was 4 years for internship and residency, and then I elected to do a fellowship in pain medicine, and you do usually get a board certification with that fellowship as well. And in addition, after that, I did 1 more fellowship in the area of research. So I use that as an example, so depending on what your interest may be, you can also add on to that. So as I was finishing my research time at Mayo, and my chairman finally said that you have had enough training, it's time for you to become a staff member and finish your education part. Does that sound good to you? And I said, sounds good. So I think I stretched it out a little bit longer, but some people, you know, depending on their particular interest, that's what they like to do, and I think the field opens up. I didn't mention that some people will actually pursue other areas of combined interest, let's say medicine and law, or these days it could be medicine with business as well. There are some MD, MBAs, and so, you know, again, there's opportunity, but this is a fairly common approach for many. And I won't go into today about what you may do after you finish your training, but it could be the standard clinical practice, but there's all sorts of other avenues as well. And I'm a good example that I practiced for 15 years and then ended up in the biotechnology field where we're developing drugs, and there's administration, there could be education, could be governmental, policy sorts of things with World Health. So a lot of different directions that a particular student or trainee may decide to go as time goes on. So some recent findings that applying to medical school still remains very competitive these days. So we advise the students who are going to be going into college to really consider that. We know the students, especially coming from this area, who are dedicated and going through things like Sherwood for additional learning, that they are very focused on the field, but at the same time recognizing that there's a lot of bright individuals, as they say. It's kind of the funnel. You start off fairly big, and as time goes on, the competitiveness continues to increase. So I don't want to say that to intimidate the students, but also to just recognize that it's a step-by-step longer course, but you have to also be very focused and very persistent as well. There were approximately 43,000 medical school applicants last year, and overall 42% were accepted, which is actually the lowest in the last 10 years statistically. So 43% is not, 42% is actually not too bad, but what I was suggesting to you is that there's a selection bias here, because you're no longer dealing with students who are at the high school level, and everyone has to go to high school and graduate here in California. But these are students who are becoming higher and higher caliber, so that they're very well qualified, but at the same time, I think it's very stimulating. Your classmates are becoming brighter and brighter. You learn from each other. It's not just that you're trying to compete with them, but you're trying to, compete with yourself to try and excel and hopefully go into the field that you're focusing on. There are approximately 18,000 medical school graduates last year. And in actuality, with the change in healthcare field we'll go into today, but that actually is not enough to cover all our needs, especially with the Affordable Care Act now. There's more demand for physicians. So I say that as an encouraging note for the students thinking about this field. There's plenty of demand for services moving forward for you to practice as a physician, and the society is really going to embrace that and welcome your contribution. So there are several key factors that I just will leave you with today. There's a lot of details that surround these three, but again, Sabrina thought if we just hit the highlights at least, they may leave you with at least some framework to consider. So first and foremost, and I won't say any one is most important than the other, but certainly the GPA continues to be very important. This is consistent with Dr. Yoshida's discussion earlier. Applying to college, the same principles apply as well to medical school. And the other is going to be your standardized exam. It's a requirement, and that's the MCAT. That's a medical college admissions test. And this test has been around for many, many years. The history was back in the 1920s that they had a number of students that started medical school and then they dropped out or failed out. So they were trying to raise the bar for screening to select individuals who'd be well qualified to go in the field, and at the same time, hopefully that they would be able to contribute as well after society would invest in them to complete their training. And then I call the third everything else bucket, and we'll go through some of those factors. And it's a very long list, but you can imagine that there's different things that a review committee would want to consider in thinking about a candidate applying to their particular medical school. It's very difficult for them to look at the individual applicants on paper and to interview them and such, and finally making the selection, because there's only a limited number of spaces for them to come on board. So there's a Venn diagram you can see in the middle, and that's the individual is going to be shaped by the GPA, their MCAT, everything else, but at the same time, that individual is looking for a match for the right school as well. That's similar to what Dr. Yoshida was saying earlier. Some schools may be looking for more of a certain characteristic, and other schools may be looking for others as well. So that's very individualized, and we'll get to that part of the application just shortly. So I just leave you with a picture, and I just saw this on the web, hundreds and hundreds of applications that these reviewers are coming to in the morning. So some of these things we'll review in just a moment, but you can imagine you want to use some common sense as an individual pursuing this field as to what a review committee may ultimately need to consider, and as they're considering many, many applications for who, let's say, are comprised of very qualified individuals for a limited number of places. And so you can look yourself in the mirror and think about what the reviewers may be looking for as well, and consider that. And then also that there's a balance as well, that there is a limited number of years that you may want to pursue the application process. It's not a 10 years process. Some people do decide to apply later, but at the same time, most typically decide during a college period. There's only so many things that you can do with a limited amount of time. You want to get good grades, you want to get good test scores, you want to have other activities as well to hopefully set you apart as being a very well-rounded, qualified applicant. So the grades, as we mentioned, very important, and that we mentioned also earlier, it can be in a science or non-science major, but in the end, that you still will need to meet the requirements for the medical school application, and those do vary from school to school. The average GPA does change a little bit from year to year. It is typically around 3.5 to 3.6 at a fairly competitive college. So again, that's a little bit variable. You can go to a less competitive college and go in with a higher GPA, or you may be in a more competitive college, your GPA may be lower. And colleges will consider that as well. They certainly are familiar with folks who have applied to their school and done well. And so they know certain undergrad colleges, oftentimes there can be a medical school advisor or counselor at that college, will develop a relationship with the medical school as well. And and so they're familiar with the candidates from over the years. If they perform well, or let's say they have a lot of struggles because they're not adequately prepared for the medical curriculum. So it can range, and that GPA is not absolute as well. It can go down, and then you'd have to make it up in the other two areas, and of course, again, the uniqueness of your application for that particular school, if they're looking for certain attributes to round out the class. So schools don't want a class where everyone is unidimensional, everyone just has a high GPA, but they didn't really do too many other things. They want some diversity so that, again, the students in that peer group can learn from each other, especially if your typical size is 120 to 150 students, and they're together over the course of a 4 year time. There are certain core classes, the biology, chemistry, physics, and math, and we already hit on the major of interest. So the medical college admissions test is timed typically around the junior year. I say this especially with the students here today that are in high school. You've got a little bit of time. You don't have to worry about the MCAT quite yet. This is based on learning that will occur through college, so it's not something you would start as a freshman and preparing for. So the timing is a little delicate. You would go through rigorous college material, and then ultimately you'd be reviewing that material and preparing for this exam. And they usually test concepts in the biological sciences is one. The other is physical sciences, and that's comprised of general chemistry, organic chemistry, and physics. And then thirdly, in verbal reasoning. And then there is another fourth section, which is usually what they call the trial section, and on those you aren't actually graded on, but they're testing questions constantly in preparing for future exams. So 3 key areas. Your score can range from 1 to 15. So your total score is 45 is what's possible. And the average medical school accepted applicant is usually around 28 to 29 for their MCAT scores. Now, by the time some of the high school students here today go through it, they may evolve the standardized test as well. So I just say this as a current, but it certainly can change over time. So the everything else, this is oftentimes things that friends who are parents of students who are preparing, they like to ask about, because it's a little less defined, right? GPA and MCAT score, we know that's what's going to get you into at least the close observation by the medical school. So again, thinking of yourself, if you're an applicant, what would you like to look for in the overall applicant that you're reviewing? So one of the key ones is that they do look for individuals who have some medical exposure or experience. You don't expect the individual to be able to take care of patients. That's not what they're looking for, because that's what you're going to be educated and trained to do in the subsequent years. However, they want to really consider, if there's only so many slots to be able to provide, does this individual who's applying have some good familiarity of the field that they're applying for? If they really don't know medicine very well, but they have a 4.0 GPA in college and their MCAT scores are 35, it's still going to make them pause and say, Is this the right individual that we want to give up one of our valuable slots for? Are they going to be able to contribute to the field over time? So they definitely want to see that, and there's different ways to gain this experience. Some people like to spend time in the hospitals volunteering or working with doctors or sometimes doing clinical research. I think all of those are very acceptable. But the key is you want to demonstrate that you've had exposure, you've seen doctors caring for patients beyond just when you or your family go into the office, and there's some dedication and commitment to actually learning that process, so it underscores your interest as an applicant for the reviewer. The medical school interviews is very, very important as well. That's where your cumulative experience really comes into play. So some individuals are, again, outstanding on paper, they're great GPA, great MCAT score, but then when you really have a chance to speak with them, it can come out at times if the individual is actually still a little bit uncertain with going into the field. You know, maybe their parents were very hopeful because the family has a lot of doctors in the family and say, oh yeah, this is the plan for you. We know some of those families. I have some friends that were of that type of extended family. Or maybe they're a little less certain. They may have a love in computer science, but you know, they think that they'll give it a try and see what happens. If it doesn't work out, they're okay with it. But again, think of yourself as a reviewer. You're giving up a valuable slot, so you really want to know that the individual, as you're speaking with them, is very well-rounded in addition to having very good scores, and they have a good sense of what they're going to encounter. And as doctors, you do have to be able to think on your feet. Some folks are very, very good at academically studying and preparing for something, and other folks have more difficulty in really thinking on the fly, which is oftentimes required for most fields of medicine. Not all fields, but many of them. You do have to make rapid decisions, and they do have to be accurate in order to best care for the patients. You're never 100%, but that's part of the process of being physician and integrated in the art and the science. So the interview is very, very important. The others are letters of recommendation. So really encourage the high school students as you go to college, get a chance to meet your professors. Many students are very intimidated. They don't want to spend too much time with their teachers, or they just ask limited questions, and then they're thinking, oh, I have all these things I need to take care of. But try and develop some relationships. Actually, the professors really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it when the students would reach out and try to talk, to try and share their ideas, ask questions. So that way you can hopefully be able to do your part in educating them as well and giving them a chance to get on the right road. And when that individual progresses in the seat, it's very, very gratifying as an educator. The other, as I mentioned, and it kind of couples what we've already touched on, is the demonstration of commitment to the field. So I say that in part because there are some students who do many, many activities, but they touch on the activities very lightly. One summer, they maybe shadow a doctor at the hospital. The next summer, maybe they do some research, preparing for some project. But there's not always a theme, that the level of commitment and depth of activity is also really important. So that's kind of a balance as an individual you really need to consider. Do you want to continue doing something, or do you want to gain a new experience? That's the tough part for 4 to 5 years for most applicants, because a lot of times you're studying and preparing for the MCAT exam, that you're trying to figure out, well, what can I do that would allow the review committee to know that, hey, I'm really committed to this field. So that's a question the individual needs to answer, but just think about that carefully. If you touch it too lightly, and we've seen this before, you start to ask even some basic questions. Well, tell me about that summertime experience that you were full-time in the hospital, but they actually don't remember it. They can't really say too much about it. Oh yeah, I showed up, and then I spent the day there, and then the summer was over. So, there must be a little bit more. You're trying to help them, but at the same time, you're struggling because there are thousands of applicants and you're trying to make the decision on. So, just consider that as you're going through and gaining your unique experiences. I mentioned the research experience. It's an option. It's not mandatory. And so there are some who've gone on and they've received very good mentorship, and they've actually been able to publish papers as part of a co-authorship. So, you know, the one thing about research is that most things in medicine, and especially in research, I always say is a team sport. So some students are a little bit intimidated. They go, gosh, I don't have a good idea. I'm afraid to go to the histology lab or the biochemistry lab because I don't know what I would want to study. I want to just relieve you of that pressure. Seek the advice of the professors and just ask them for opportunities to engage. Is there an opportunity? Are you looking for a student? You know, I'm planning for a career in medicine, and this would be really relevant for me if I could spend some time and willing to help out as part of the team. And you may or may not get a publication. That's not even the most important thing, but a chance to gain that experience and see the rigor of what is involved in asking scientific questions and then actually using the scientific method and then coming up with findings that you interpret. You know, it's all part of the learning process. And if an applicant can talk about what they've learned, that to me is always really impressive as the one that publish a paper, but actually they can't really talk about the paper so much because they're not sure of all the details that went on to it. You don't need to know all of it, but you know, it's again that kind of balance. The other is, I'd say quite important, applying to a number of medical schools and also a range of medical schools as well. Even some individuals who are really top applicants, at times they're surprised, we're surprised that they actually don't get into a school. And in part, you know, it could be for many reasons. And as I was talking about the Venn diagram, there's a uniqueness of you for as the individual, and there's the uniqueness of what the schools that you're applying to may be looking for. And sometimes the fit's not exactly there. So if you can apply to a greater range, so I would usually divide it into at least a strategy of 3 different areas. One is where you think you're actually well matched for the schools that you're applying. The other is to have some schools where you think actually you're overqualified. They say, gosh, it's not my top choice, but go ahead and apply if you're willing to go there. So that if you get surprised in not getting in your top schools, at least there's some backup options. And then there's some schools where you want to reach a little bit. You say, gosh, I'm not sure if exactly I qualify, but I think I did well enough on this. If I could get to the interview, hopefully I can communicate to the school that I'm very committed to this area, and they may recognize that as well. Sometimes it's just the matter of ideal timing, that they're looking for a certain candidate and you might be the certain candidate at the right time in the right place. Apply to schools early if you're able. So this is kind of really going down quite a number of years and things may change, but traditionally, usually the applications start in the summertime of your senior year. So again, senior year could be your 4th year, it could be your 5th year. And usually by then you've completed your required coursework for application, and you've also completed your MCAT scores, and the scores are available so you can put it in the application. So you can think about the timing that as part of your junior year, you're going to need to take your MCAT, and that can be either in the fall or the springtime. Usually in the past, and you'd have to look at the more current guidelines because it's been a few years since I've been with the medical school, that sometimes in the fall of the senior may still be possible as well. But the earlier apply, because most schools it's rolling admissions, unlike some of the schools that Dr. Chu made a touch base on, that as your applications go in and they identify good qualified applicants, they'll start offering admissions as they go through the interviews process. And they want to lock up good candidates. They said, this is a really good individual. Good thing we got them to interview her early. This is a person we want to bring on. Let's issue our offer of acceptance, and hopefully they'll reply and decide to provide a letter of intent to come to us. The other is you want to submit quality applications so that you answer all the questions, and there can be what we call secondary applications. You go through the initial primary application. There could be additional questions that they want to know and learn more about. That's a little less structured sometimes as well. You know, they may, and I think you're all familiar with these with the high school, you know, what's the most interesting things you've done, or what's the biggest challenge you face. Sometimes there can be more details, and each school can vary because there's no set approach to secondary applications. But you want to really put your time into it. Senior year in the fall probably isn't the time that you want to be, let's say, most challenged with your academic college requirements, because you're going to be trying to juggle this and submit very good applications that hopefully the review committees will consider favorably. Lastly, this comes from the dean of the medical school that I was talking to. He said, at all costs, avoiding legal or academic integrity issues. So I say that, and it's very obvious, but at the same time, thinking about the original pictures I was showing, you're looking yourself in the mirror, you're now the review committee, what are you looking for? There's thousands of applicants, very qualified, you only have 150 slots. If you have an individual that has unfortunately faced some academic integrity issues, they were caught cheating, submitting plagiarism, those sorts of things, your chances all of a sudden go down dramatically. He says at his school, basically, it's very easy. That person would be removed from the candidacy of the pool just because there's just too many people applying. So when you're going through the challenge of college, at times there could be some temptation. Avoid it at all costs for this field, because being a physician, there's a requirement for high ethical standards, high integrity as well, and so they're looking for these sorts of things. Face the challenge, things will work out okay. It's much better to not get a good grade than to compromise your integrity and then get caught and your application is going to be really affected. The other is the legal part. We were all kids once, sometimes we make mistakes, but really consider carefully as a college student where all of a sudden you're no longer with the family, you have a chance to experience all sorts of things, and just be very careful on what you do and consider what would demonstrate your high moral character. That's obvious for those that are here today, that you're very committed and very interested, and just carry through, be consistent with that. So just summarize that, just consider the 3 keys. That's what I did when I was applying, because you can really get lost in a lot of the details. If you really think GPA, MCAT, and this other key category with the interviews, your letters of recommendation, other qualities that you can demonstrate as an individual. Don't be intimidated by other really qualified and exciting applicants in your peer group. We all heard about individuals that were doing remarkable things, and that's the kind of field that that attracts these sorts of individuals. But we hear about them sometimes, and wow, how on earth do they find time to do these things? It's very impressive. But just consider, these eventually could be your peers you get in, and these are the people that you want to work with and learn from. And actually you gain a lot because you educate and learn from each other. Stay focused and disciplined. I know it's not so applicable to this group, but go to class. In college, you don't have to go to class. Some people start going occasionally, and then all of a sudden they start to become more regular and not going. They like to study on their own. But there's some real benefit to hearing not just what the professor is teaching, but the tone that they teach, the way they give the inflection for the material. It can make a difference in highlighting what's going to be important and what's not, even if you're borrowing someone's notes. And be persistent. So the other thing that my colleague, the dean of the medical school, had mentioned is that you're not initially accepted, reapplying is a definite option. It is not the end. In fact, the average age for medical school applicants is around 24 years of age. So that really suggests there's a lot of people reapplying. So if you don't get in the first time, it is not the end. Don't be so disappointed. Reapply. Schools, and they see this is a really persistent individual. It's the second time applying, third time applying. In the meantime, they've not only taken a good application, they've made it better. They gained these other relevant experiences. This individual is obviously committed. It can really sway the committee, it can really sway the reviewer as well. So the statistic that the dean had mentioned is that 40% of a peer group typically will get accepted for a given year's application. By the time of 3 additional years, that number will, for that same peer group, approaches 60%. So there's another 15% of that same original applying group who's going to get in, and part of it again is the persistence. I know a number of people who are fine physicians now, they didn't get in the first time, and they did something meaningful the next year, and they reapplied, and the committees really liked them. In fact, sometimes you get surprised. What happened the first year? Yes, they did more, but they got into so many places the next time around. So, just keep focused and be persistent. Don't be disappointed. That should occur. I suspect many individuals here may actually just flat out get in, but still nonetheless it does happen just because of the level of competitiveness. And then lastly, just to leave you that each applicant is really uniquely different, and you need to just take the opportunity to see and talk to a lot of people about how you can shape your interests as well. It's not, again, just trying to compete with other individuals, but as you go through that process, you're really going to identify, your commitment, your interests, the really unique experiences, things that I gained when I was a college pre-med, I still draw upon and I really, at times, reflect upon and look back and go, gosh, it's funny how things, decades later, that some of the original interests that were there actually still remain there. For me, it's the clinical research part, which ultimately drew me to the biotechnology side of things. That I was doing research as a college student, and that was very meaningful to me. And one of the professors gave me an opportunity and said, yeah, you can come by, and this summer you can start, and if it goes well, you can continue into the school year. And that's what I did, and we developed some publications, they got into the journals, and I didn't do research for a number of years after that, but then eventually it came back around, and I would expect for many of the pre-med applicants that could potentially happen as well. So